Hello and welcome back. Some think rules are made to be broken. This isn't true when it comes to amateur radio. Some of the FCC rules we'll learn date back to the 1930s. They're just as valid today as they were back then. Once you receive your license, you can experiment and even design your own transmitters if you're so inclined. However, it doesn't give you the right to build and operate something that adversely affects others through harmful interference or other annoyances like, for example, making your neighbor's garage door go up and down each time you key your transmitter. Knowing the rules and observing them will help you make your airwave experience hassle-free. Not to mention knowing them will help you pass the exam. Well, are you ready to learn? Well, let's get started. This video is Lesson 1, Part 4 of my Amateur Radio Technician Class License course covering the 2022 to 2026 question pool. I'm your instructor, Gary Stevens, and my call sign is Kilo Echo 2 Golf Sierra. I hold an amateur extra license, and I've been teaching amateur radio for over 15 years now. The Subelement T1 section covers the Commission's rules from the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. 6 exam questions will be randomly selected from Subelement T1. The Commission's rules are divided into 6 groups with a total of 67 questions. Today we will cover Tango 1 Delta, authorized and prohibited transmissions, communications with other countries, music, exchange of information with other services, indecent language, compensation for operating, retransmission of other amateur signals, encryption, sale of equipment, identified transmission or unidentified transmissions, and one-way transmissions. First thing we need to learn in Lesson 1, Part 4, FCC licensed amateur radio stations are prohibited from exchanging communications with any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, that it objects to such communications. I'm unaware of any such country objecting, but you always have to be aware that that is possible. Find the answer in Part 97.111, Authorized Transmissions. It reads, transmissions necessary to exchange messages with other stations in the amateur radio service, except those in any country whose administration has notified the ITU that it objects to such communications. The FCC will issue public notices of current arrangements for international communications. Second question will be similar to this. With which countries are the FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communications? A, any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, that it objects to such communication. B, any country whose administration has notified the American Radio Relay League, ARRL, that it objects to such communications. C, any country banned from such communications by the International Amateur Radio Union, IARU. Or D, any country banned from making such communications by the Amateur Radio Relay League, ARRL. If you answered A, any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, that objects to such communications, you're going to be famous. If you missed it, I'm sure you'll get it right next time. We need to know that an amateur station shall not engage in any form of broadcasting. Question comes from Part 97.113, Prohibited Transmissions. It explicitly states, an amateur station shall not engage in any form of broadcasting, nor may an amateur station transmit one-way communications except as specifically provided in these rules. nor shall an amateur station engage in any activity related to program production or news gathering for broadcasting purposes, except that communications directly related to the immediate safety of human life and the protection of property may be provided by amateur stations to broadcasters for dissemination to the public where no other means of communication is reasonably available before or at the time of the event. Scam question is similar to this. Under which of the following circumstances are one-way transmissions by an amateur station prohibited? Alpha, in all circumstances. Bravo, broadcasting. C, or Charlie, international Morse code practice. Or D, Delta, telecommand or transmissions of telemetry. If you answered B, broadcasting, then awesome sauce. If not, keep trying. You can do this. We need to understand that only when transmitting control commands to a space station or radio-controlled craft is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to obscure their meaning. It only makes sense that we should protect the control of a satellite, else someone could send control signals that make it do nefarious things. Likewise, it wouldn't be good for someone to take over control of our drone, even a remote-controlled airplane. Part 97.211, Space Telecommand, tells us a telecommand station may transmit special codes intended to obscure the meaning of telecommand messages to the station in space operation. Part 97.215, Telecommand of Model Craft, we are told, the control signals are not considered codes or ciphers intended to obscure the meaning of the communication. On the exam you may see this. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to obscure their meaning? Alpha, only during contests. Bravo, only when transmitting certain approved digital codes. Charlie, only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio-controlled craft. D, never. If you answered Charlie, only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio-controlled craft, you are on a roll. Otherwise, keep on trying. The exam you need to understand that an amateur station is authorized to transmit music using a phone emission when it is incidental to authorized retransmission of a manned spacecraft communications. This question also comes from Part 97.113, Prohibited transmissions. Let's zoom in so we can see this a little better. It says, music using a phone emission, except as specifically provided elsewhere in this section, communications intended to facilitate a criminal act, messages encoded for the purpose of obscuring their meaning, except otherwise provided herein, obscene or indecent words or language, or false or deceptive messages, signals, or identification. In Section C of Part 97.113, it tells us that no station shall retransmit programs or signals emanating from any type of radio station other than an amateur station, except propagation and weather forecast information intended for use by the general public and originated from United States government stations, and communications including incidental music originating on the United States government frequencies between a manned spacecraft and its associated Earth station. Prior approval for manned spacecraft communication retransmissions must be obtained from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Such retransmissions must be for the exclusive use of amateur radio operators. Propagation, weather forecast, and manned spacecraft communication retransmissions may not be conducted on a regular basis, but only occasionally as an incident of normal amateur radio communications. This question on your exam, it'll look something like this. Under what conditions is an amateur station authorized to transmit music using a phone emission? A. When incidental to an authorized retransmission of a manned spacecraft communication. B. When the music produces no spurious emissions. C. When transmissions are limited to less than 3 minutes per hour. D. When the music is transmitted above 1280 megahertz. If you answered A, when incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communications, pat yourself on the back. Otherwise, you can always rewatch the video and try it again. To know that amateur radio operators may use their stations to notify other amateurs of equipment available for sale or trade, but only when selling amateur radio equipment is not on a regular basis. This answer also comes from Part 97.113, Prohibited Transmissions. It says, an amateur operator may notify other amateur operators of the availability for sale or trade of apparatuses normally used in an amateur station, provided that such activity is not conducted on a regular basis. So, on the exam, the question will be something like this. When may an amateur operator use their stations to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade? A. Never. B. When the equipment is not personal property of either the station licensee or the control operator or their close relatives. C. When no profit is made on the sale. D. When selling amateur radio equipment is not on a regular basis. Did you answer D, when selling amateur radio equipment is not on a regular basis? If so, wonderbar. If not, don't give up. You can do this. I have confidence in you. You absolutely need to know this. There are restrictions concerning the transmission of language that may be considered indecent or obscene. Therefore, any such language is prohibited. I don't know about you, but I abhor listening to someone using foul language. Think of amateur radio as being G-rated and suitable for all audiences. Our answer comes from Part 97.113, Prohibited Transmissions. Surprise! There it spells out that obscene or indecent words or language are prohibited. On the exam, the question may appear in this manner. What, if any, are the restrictions concerning the transmit of languages that may be considered indecent or obscene? Alpha, the FCC maintains a list of words that are not permitted to be used on the amateur frequencies. Bravo, any such language is prohibited. Charlie, the ITU maintains a list of words that are not permitted to be used on the amateur frequencies. Or D, there's no such prohibition. Do you answer B? Any such language is prohibited? If so, you are cooking with gas. If you missed it, try again. You also need to know, repeater, auxiliary, or space stations are amateur stations that can automatically retransmit signals of other amateur stations. By now you should realize the importance of knowing what transmissions are prohibited. This question comes from Part 97.113, Prohibited Transmissions. We can see that no amateur station except an auxiliary, repeater, or space station may automatically retransmit the radio signals of another amateur station. If you're not familiar with these types of systems, fear not, we're going to talk about them in more detail later. Sam may have this question. What types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the signals of another amateur station? A, or alpha, auxiliary beacon or earth stations. B, Bravo, earth, repeater, or space stations. Charlie, beacon, repeater, or space stations. D, repeater, auxiliary, or space stations. You should have answered D, repeater, auxiliary, or space stations. Another pearl of wisdom we should know is, when communications are incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution, the control operator of an amateur station may receive compensation for operating that station. Again, we find our answer in Part 97.113, Prohibited Transmissions. While we're not to be paid for operating our rigs, there is one exception. A control operator may accept compensation as an incident of a teaching position during periods of time when an amateur station is being used by that teacher as part of a classroom instruction at an educational institution. The question will appear something like this. In which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur station receive compensation for operating that station? A, when the communication is related to the sale of amateur equipment by the control operator's employer. B, when the communications is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. C, when the communication is made to obtain emergency information for a local broadcast station. D, all of these choices are correct. If you answered B, you're a genius. The correct answer is when the communication is incidental to the classroom instruction at an educational institution. You should know that amateur stations may transmit information in support of broadcasting, program production, and news gathering, assuming there's no other means is available, when such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life and the protection of property. Part 97.113, we can see, number 5, communications on a regular basis which can reasonably be furnished alternatively through other radio services. B, an amateur station shall not engage in any form of broadcasting, nor may an amateur station transmit one-way communications except as specifically provided in these rules, nor shall an amateur station engage in any activity related to program production or news gathering for broadcasting purposes, except that communications directly related to the immediate safety of human life or the protection of property may be provided by amateur stations to broadcasters for dissemination to the public where no other means of communication is reasonably available before or at the time of the event. Look at this question, it will be similar to this. When may amateur stations transmit information supporting broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available? A, when such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life and the protection of property. B, when broadcasting communications to or from the space shuttle. C, where non-commercial programming is gathered and supplied exclusively to the National Public Radio Network. D, never. Of course, the correct answer is A, when such communications are directly related to the immediate safety of human life and the protection of property. To know, the FCC defines broadcasting for the amateur radio service as transmissions intended for reception by the general public. We find this in Part 97.3, Definitions. It defines broadcasting as transmissions intended for the reception by the general public, either direct or relayed. In the exam we might see, how does the FCC define broadcasting for the amateur radio service? A. Two-way transmission by amateur stations. B. Any transmission made by the licensed station. C. Transmissions of a message directed only to the amateur operators. Or D. Transmissions intended for reception by the general public. Of course, we know that the answer is D. Transmissions intended for reception by the general public. Finally, we need to know that when transmitting signals to control model craft, an amateur station may transmit without identifying on the air. We get this information from Part 97.119, Station Identification. Each amateur station, except a space station or telecommand station, must transmit its assigned call sign on its transmitting channel at the end of each communication and at least every 10 minutes during a communication, for the purpose of clearly making the source of the transmission from the station known to those receiving the transmission. No station may transmit unidentified communications or signals or transmit as a station call sign. Any call sign not authorized to the station. The question may appear such as this: when may an amateur station transmit without identifying on the air? When the transmissions are of a brief nature to make station adjustments. B. When the transmissions are unmodulated. C. When the transmitted power level is below 1 watt. Or D. When transmitting signals to control model craft. The answer is D, when transmitting signals to control model craft. This is the end of Lesson 1, Part 4. Are we having fun yet? I hope so. While rules may seem to be boring to some, knowing them will help you pass your exam and help you and others have an enjoyable experience with amateur radio. I would like to leave you with a quote from Albert Einstein. He once said that intellectual growth should commence at birth and cease only at death. Till next time, my friends, never stop learning.